Dinner reservation was made, the table set, but David Aldridge wasn't expecting a meal. He was expecting the truth. It had been months of suspicion, quiet conversations with himself in the dark hours of the night when the weight of doubt felt unbearable. Sophia, his wife of 15 years, had changed. The woman he thought he knew had slipped into someone else, someone he no longer recognized. She smiled more often now, but it wasn't for him. Her wardrobe had shifted. The perfume she wore smelled different, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she wasn't the woman who had promised him forever. It all led him here, to this moment, sitting in a corner booth at a fancy restaurant, waiting for Sophia to walk in, and for everything to fall apart. When she arrived, David's heart clenched. She wasn't alone. Across from her, sitting with an easy confidence, was Mark Dalton, the man she had been seeing behind David's back. In that instant, all the whispers in David's mind turned to shouts. He had the proof now, all the evidence he needed. The betrayal was no longer a possibility. It was real. And in a few short minutes, he would confront the woman he once trusted, the woman he had shared his life with. But the hardest part wasn't confronting her. It was seeing her try to justify it, to explain away the unexplainable. Suspicion breeds doubt. It had started as a whisper in David Aldridge's mind, a quiet unease that grew louder with each passing day. At first, it was subtle, small changes in Sophia's behavior that could be explained away by the busyness of life. But over time, those changes became harder to ignore. The way she suddenly started paying more attention to her appearance, buying clothes she had never worn before, the way she smiled a little too brightly when she talked about her work. It felt like she was trying too hard to hide something. David had always trusted Sophia. They had been married for over 15 years, built a life together, shared memories, inside jokes, struggles, and triumphs. But something in the way she now looked at him, or rather, didn't look at him, started to feel different. The distance between them wasn't physical at first. It was emotional, subtle, yet ever present, like an invisible wall slowly creeping into their relationship. It wasn't just the way she dressed or her newfound energy when she spoke about her job. Things had felt colder between them at home too. She'd grown distant, not in a way that screamed, "I don't love you anymore," but in a way that said, "I'm not really here anymore." The long talks they once had before bed, the quiet moments of shared understanding, had been replaced with silence. When they did talk, it was surface level, more like roommates than the partners they had once been. Then there was the matter of her phone. Sophia used to leave it lying around casually, but now it was always near her, her screen face down whenever David walked into the room. It seemed like an innocent enough habit, until it didn't. And then there were the late nights at work, the sudden business trips that popped up with no warning, the quiet but consistent text messages she kept responding to, messages she never seemed to want David to see. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he didn't know how far it had gone. The nagging suspicion in the back of his mind told him he was being paranoid, but something told him it was more than that. He just needed to know for sure. After all, trust had been the foundation of their marriage. If that was shattered, what did they have left? The first step was something David never thought he would do. He hired a private investigator. Investigation and proof. David's suspicions had been eating at him for months, gnawing away at the quiet moments of his life. What had started as a few offhand thoughts, a strange comment here, a distant gaze there, gradually turned into an overwhelming feeling that he could no longer ignore. It wasn't that he wanted to distrust Sophia. He loved her. But love alone couldn't erase the growing distance between them. She was slipping through his fingers, and the more he tried to hold on, the further she seemed to drift. At first, David tried to brush it off. He chalked up her late nights at the office, her sudden changes in routine, and the distant, distracted way she spoke to the normal pressures of life. But as the weeks wore on, the subtle changes became impossible to overlook. Sophia had started acting differently, and so had he. He found himself questioning small things that never used to matter. The way she'd avoid eye contact when he asked about her day, how her phone was always face down, how the intimacy they had once shared felt foreign now. Each little shift in behavior felt like a red flag waving in front of him. but he didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to face the reality that something was wrong, that something could have gone terribly awry between them. David spent nights replaying moments in his mind, an offhand remark she'd made about her long days at the office, the way she had begun dressing more provocatively, how she'd suddenly taken an interest in things she'd never cared about before. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The intuition he had been suppressing finally screamed at him. There was something, someone else. But confronting Sophia about it felt impossible. He couldn't ask her directly. Not yet. The thought of accusing her without solid proof terrified him. But the unknown was more terrifying. David had always prided himself on his instincts, but this felt too big to leave to gut feelings alone. He needed hard facts. So with a sense of both resolve and dread, he did the unthinkable. He hired a private investigator. The decision was a struggle. He had never imagined it would come to this, hiring someone to follow his wife to dig into the life that they had shared together. But as the investigator started following Sophia, gathering information, sending photos of her meeting with Mark, and tracking her late-night activities, David's world began to unravel. The evidence was undeniable. Texts, phone calls, intimate dinners, all the things David had once brushed off now painted a clear, painful picture. For 3 months, David lived in a state of suspended disbelief, hoping that somehow the investigator would return with news that would clear Sophia's name. But instead, each new piece of information only deepened the wound. There was no denying it. Sophia had betrayed him. The photos were the hardest to look at. The way they laughed together, how they shared knowing glances, the intimacy of their body language. David wasn't naive. He knew what he was seeing. His wife was having an affair. The world he had built with Sophia now seemed like a lie, a cruel illusion. He didn't know whether he felt more anger or heartbreak, but what he did know was that there was no going back. The woman he loved had betrayed him in the most painful way imaginable. The walls around his heart had begun to build, brick by brick, and as each new revelation came to light, the truth felt like an anchor pulling him under. But the hardest part was the weight. The investigator had everything David needed, but it still wasn't enough. He couldn't unsee the images or erase the weight of the truth. He was stuck in limbo, unable to confront her yet, but knowing that his life was about to change in a way he could never undo. The revelation. David hadn't been prepared for it, not in the way he thought he would be. He'd spent months piecing together his suspicions, analyzing every shift in Sophia's behavior, hoping it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as the investigator handed him the final batch of photographs, everything he had feared and more became undeniable. The photos were crisp, clear, and painfully detailed. There was no mistaking the intimacy captured in the frames. Sophia and Mark, laughing together over a shared bottle of wine, their faces inches apart, the easy familiarity between them that David had once thought was reserved for their marriage. There were shots of them walking down the street hand in hand, their chemistry so apparent that it felt like a slap in the face. And then the final blow. Images of them entering a hotel late at night, their bodies pressed close, the door closing behind them, sealing David's worst fear inside. He couldn't bring himself to look at them for long, but there was no escaping the truth staring back at him. Sophia, the woman he had shared his life with for over 15 years, had crossed a line. She was no longer the person he thought he knew. The trust, the foundation they had built had crumbled in an instant, like fragile glass falling to the ground. David's hands shook as he turned away from the investigator's office, clutching the photographs as though they might dissolve if he let go. But they wouldn't dissolve. The evidence was real, and for the first time, David felt something deep inside him snap. The weight of betrayal pressed down on his chest, suffocating him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The idea of confronting Sophia, of looking into her eyes and saying the words he had never imagined uttering, felt like a foreign concept. He had always prided himself on being a man who didn't need drama, who didn't need confrontation. But now, the truth demanded action. He needed to hear it from her own lips, to see her reaction, to force her to face the consequences of what she had done. David spent the next few hours lost in thought, replaying every moment of their marriage, every memory that now seemed tainted by the truth. How many times had he missed the signs? How many times had he dismissed his own intuition, convincing himself that everything was fine? The life they had built together, those shared memories, those years of intimacy and trust, felt like a lie. He could no longer look at the things that once meant the most to him without feeling betrayed. The anger began to rise within him, a slow burn that started in his gut and spread through his chest. It was a fury that had been building for months, held back by the hope that he was wrong, that he was just imagining things. But now, as he looked at the photographs once more, the anger felt justified, deserved. She had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible, with someone who was supposed to be a colleague, a person David had never questioned. The lines between professional and personal had been blurred, and David could no longer stand to be in the dark about it. He didn't know if it was fear or rage that made him call the restaurant, arranging the dinner reservation. He didn't know if it was the need for closure or just the overwhelming desire to confront Sophia and force her to answer for what she had done. But by the time he hung up the phone, the decision had been made. The confrontation was inevitable. The next day, he found himself at that same restaurant, sitting in the corner booth, staring at the empty chair across from him. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know what he wanted to hear. All he knew was that he needed to confront her, to make her face the truth. He had seen the photos, felt the depth of her betrayal. Now he would make her admit it. Sophia walked in a few minutes later, her smile bright, her eyes sparkling in the way they always did when she was excited about something. But the moment she saw him sitting there, the smile faltered. There was an odd tension in the air, and David could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the brief moment where she realized the jig was up. She didn't sit down right away, instead standing by the table as if deciding whether to sit or flee. But David didn't let her. He slid the photographs across the table, the weight of them almost tangible. "Tell me this isn't true, Sophia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but thick with emotion. "Tell me you didn't do this to us." The confrontation. As Sophia sat down across from David, the once familiar warmth between them completely evaporated. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, just an uneasy silence that hung heavily in the air. David's heart raced, but he kept his face stoic, focusing all his energy on keeping his emotions in check. He had come here for one reason, to make her face the truth. He didn't care about her excuses, her attempts to shift the blame, or the lies she might try to weave. He was past that. This was about forcing her to acknowledge what she had done to their marriage, to him, and to their family. Sophia was already fidgeting, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her wine glass. She wasn't the same woman he had fallen in love with, and that thought twisted something deep inside him. She was a stranger now, someone who had carefully hidden her betrayal behind a veil of false smiles and empty words. But David couldn't play along anymore. Not tonight. "Do you know why I asked you here?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of pain. Sophia didn't immediately answer. Instead, she glanced around the restaurant, almost as if she were searching for an escape route. David's patience was running thin, but he wasn't about to let her avoid this. He pushed the stack of photographs across the table, the crisp images sliding forward with a cold finality. The photo of her and Mark at the restaurant, the one where their eyes met intimately over their dinner. David watched as Sophia's gaze faltered. Sophia's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the photos, her eyes scanning them briefly, then flicking back up to meet David's. For a moment, she was silent, her expression unreadable, but David could see the change in her. The woman who had been so confident moments ago was now visibly rattled. He had exposed the secret she had carefully hidden for so long. "David," she began, her voice sounding strained, almost apologetic, but David didn't let her finish. He couldn't. "You're really going to try to justify this?" he interrupted, leaning forward, the sharpness in his voice betraying the calm exterior he was trying to maintain. "You think you can just explain away what you've done to us? To me?" He shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. The anger, the betrayal, everything that had been simmering inside him for months was threatening to explode. Sophia looked away briefly, her eyes darting nervously around the restaurant, perhaps looking for some kind of comfort or escape. But there was no escaping this moment. David wasn't going to let her run, not this time. He needed the truth, the cold, unvarnished truth. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Sophia said softly, her voice cracking as she spoke. Her eyes finally met David's again, filled with guilt, but also something else: defensiveness, a reluctance to truly own what she had done. "I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." David's jaw tightened. The words sounded so hollow to him, as if she was more concerned with her own comfort than the damage she had caused. "It just happened?" he repeated, his voice low and controlled but filled with disbelief. "You think this just happened?" He leaned in closer, his words biting. "You lied to me for months, Sophia. You were hiding it in plain sight. You were planning this step by step with him, and now you're telling me it just happened?" Sophia's face turned pale as she absorbed the full force of his accusation. She opened her mouth, perhaps to apologize again, but nothing came out. The weight of her actions was finally sinking in. She had no defense, no way to spin the situation. David saw it in her eyes, her regret, her guilt, the awareness that she couldn't erase the truth. But as much as he longed to hear her say the words, to hear her admit the full extent of the betrayal, she still wasn't ready. "I wasn't happy, David," Sophia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hadn't been for a while. We stopped talking. We stopped being who we were. And Mark, he was there. He listened. He made me feel seen." She paused, her lips trembling slightly, as if she were struggling to express something she knew couldn't be fixed with words. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I'm not the person you think I am anymore. I haven't been for a long time." David's chest tightened as he heard her words, but they didn't bring the closure he expected. They only made him feel more hollow, more devastated. She wasn't asking for his forgiveness, and yet she had already written the final chapter of their story. The life they had shared, the love they once had been broken long before this night. In that moment, David understood there was nothing left to save. He couldn't even look at her anymore. Not the way he used to. Not the way he had once admired every part of her, every detail that made her Sophia. Now, all he could see was a woman who had taken everything he thought they had and discarded it like it was never real. "I want a divorce," he said, the words heavy with finality. His hands shook as he slid the divorce papers across the table. "I think we've both known this was coming for a while, and I'm done, Sophia. I can't do this anymore." Sophia stared at the papers, her lips parted as if she were about to speak but couldn't find the words. Her eyes welled with tears, but there was no more room for sympathy. David's decision was final. The confrontation wasn't about saving anything. It was about ending the lie, about reclaiming the pieces of himself he had left behind in the wreckage of their marriage. The fallout. The restaurant's ambient noise faded into the background as David sat across from Sophia, the weight of his decision settling heavily in the pit of his stomach. The shock from the confrontation hadn't yet worn off, but he couldn't dwell on it. He had to focus on what came next, what he was going to do with the wreckage she had left in her wake. Sophia's eyes lingered on the divorce papers, as if hoping they would disappear, but they stayed right where David had placed them, a symbol of his final, irrevocable choice. Her eyes brimmed with tears now, her voice trembling as she whispered, "David, please, I didn't want it to end like this. I never wanted to hurt you." David didn't respond right away. His chest felt tight, his heart a war zone of conflicting emotions. Anger, yes, but also something deeper, something far more complicated. A quiet, aching sadness that hadn't yet fully surfaced. He didn't know whether to be furious or devastated by her words. He had been living in the shadow of her betrayal for months, but hearing her beg for him to understand, it hurt in ways he didn't know he could still be hurt. "I didn't ask for this," David said slowly, his voice low but firm. "I didn't ask for any of it. You made the choices, Sophia, not me. You had every chance to come to me, to talk about it, but you didn't. You chose to hide it. You chose him." Sophia shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face as she tried to reach for his hand, but David pulled it away before she could touch him. She hadn't earned that kind of comfort from him anymore. Not after everything. "You think I didn't know that?" Sophia's voice cracked, her face crumpling as if the burden of her guilt had finally caught up with her. I've been living with it every day, hiding it from you, lying to you, keeping this secret. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I never wanted to hurt you this way. I never wanted to destroy us. David's eyes softened just for a moment before the bitter reality hit him again. It doesn't matter what you wanted, it's done now. And no matter how much you regret it, no matter how many times you cry, it won't fix what's broken. There was a long silence between them. David could feel the tension in the air, the distance growing between them with every passing second, the same distance that had been growing for months, even years. He had seen the subtle changes in Sophia, the way her eyes had grown distant, the way she had pulled away from him physically and emotionally. He had ignored it, brushed it off as a phase, as stress, as life just getting in the way. He had been so focused on their shared history, on what they had been, that he couldn't see the cracks spreading wide beneath the surface. Sophia had been more than just his wife. She had been his best friend, his confidant, the mother of his children. He had thought they were a team, but now, as he looked at her, he realized that they had been living in different worlds, and she had already checked out long before the affair had begun. I don't know who you are anymore, David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't trying to be cruel, but the truth stung nonetheless. The woman I married would never have done this. You wouldn't have torn our family apart like this. Sophia's face crumpled, her tears flowing freely now. She had no words left. Nothing she could say would undo the harm she had caused. She had broken something in David that couldn't be fixed by apologies or regret. They were both far past the point of repair. Please, David, she begged, her voice hoarse. I know I can't take it back, but can't we at least try to figure out what's next? For the kids? The mention of their two daughters, Emma and Lily, was like a punch to the gut. David closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The thought of how this would affect their family, the two girls they had raised together, cut through him like a blade. Emma and Lily had always been the light of their lives, and now their world was about to be shattered. There was no easy way to explain this to them. They were already old enough to understand the dynamics of relationships, and the fallout from their parents' divorce would echo through their lives in ways neither of them could fully predict. David sat back, trying to compose himself. He didn't want to get lost in the sea of emotions flooding him. He had to think clearly. He had to be strong for Emma and Lily, even if it felt like his own world was falling apart. They'll need us both, he said quietly, the weight of the responsibility now settling over him. We're going to have to figure out how to co-parent for them. No matter what happens between us, we can't let them feel like they're caught in the middle. They deserve better than that. Sophia nodded, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She had betrayed David, yes, but now she had to face the consequences of what her actions had done to their children. She had broken their family, and the path ahead was one she would have to walk alone. I'm sorry, she whispered through her tears, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. David's eyes stung with tears of his own, but he held them back. There was no room for weakness right now, not when they still had so much to sort through. He stood up slowly, pushing the chair back with a soft scrape on the floor. I'll be in touch about the divorce proceedings, he said, his voice thick with finality. But for now, we're done. I hope you understand that. Sophia's tear-filled eyes followed him as he turned to leave, but David didn't look back. There was nothing left to say. No words could erase the betrayal, no apology could fix the gaping hole she had left in their marriage. All he could do now was move forward, one painful step at a time. The aftermath. The days following their confrontation were a blur for David. Everything felt surreal, like he was moving through a fog of grief, confusion, and anger. The reality of the divorce hadn't quite sunk in. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of a chapter of his life. The person he thought he knew better than anyone, the woman who had been his partner, his confidant, his family, she was now a stranger to him. Every corner of their house held memories of a life they had built together. And yet, with each passing day, those memories felt increasingly hollow. The silence between them was deafening. David had moved into the guest room, and although it was only a few steps away from the bedroom they had once shared, it felt like an entire world away. The walls felt tighter, smaller, as though they were closing in on him with each passing hour. He couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. Every room, every object seemed to carry the burden of betrayal. The place that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. David's mind was a constant whirlwind, replaying the moments he'd spent with Sophia, their laughter, their quiet talks late at night, the way they had supported each other through the highs and lows of life. But those memories now clashed with the image of her with Mark, the secretive, intimate conversations, the lies, and the pain she had caused. It felt like an emotional tug of war, the memories he cherished being pulled away by the harsh truth he had uncovered. Every time he tried to move forward, the past reached out and dragged him back. His thoughts often turned to their daughters, Emma and Lily. The idea of explaining them that their parents were no longer together was overwhelming. He had promised himself that he would be strong for them, that he would shield them from the brunt of the pain. But how could he protect them from something so monumental? How would he explain to Emma, who was old enough to understand the significance of the split, that the family they once knew was no more? The guilt gnawed at him. He hadn't wanted this for them. He hadn't wanted any of it. But the weight of Sophia's betrayal had left him with no choice. He couldn't live in a lie. He couldn't stay in a marriage that had been hollowed out by secrets. Yet, as much as he was resolute in his decision, he also knew that the damage wasn't just between him and Sophia. It extended to their children. Emma and Lily would have to navigate this fractured world, and no matter how well they co-parented, no matter how many times they told them they would always be there for them, things would never be the same. David found himself drifting further away from Sophia. They had settled into a cold, transactional form of communication, discussing only what was necessary for the kids or the logistics of the divorce. There was no warmth, no empathy. The woman he had once trusted with his heart now felt like a distant acquaintance. It wasn't just the affair that had driven them apart. It was everything that came after. The lies, the silence, the inability to truly acknowledge the depth of the hurt they had caused each other. One evening, when Emma and Lily were at their grandmother's house, David found himself staring at the photo of him and Sophia from their wedding day. The photo had been on the mantle for years, a constant reminder of their commitment to each other. Now, it felt like a relic from another lifetime, a time when everything had seemed simple and right. He reached for it, his hand trembling as he traced the edge of the frame. The faces staring back at him no longer felt like the people he knew. There was a sharpness to the memory, a reminder of what had been lost, that made his chest ache. He put the photo down and exhaled sharply, trying to push away the wave of sorrow that threatened to engulf him. But the hurt lingered, an ever-present shadow that followed him throughout the day. He didn't know if it would ever go away. He wasn't sure how to heal from something like this, from being betrayed in such a deep, personal way. Despite the emotional turmoil, David found moments of clarity. In the silence of the guest room, as he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he realized that his life wasn't over. It felt like the world had ended, but that was only because he had been living in the aftermath of betrayal. There was a life beyond this pain. He wasn't sure what it would look like yet, but he knew he couldn't stay stuck in the past. For his daughters, for himself, he had to find a way to move forward. The first step was accepting that there would be no easy resolution. There would be no quick fix to the wreckage Sophia had caused, no way to simply erase the betrayal and the scars it had left. But there would be healing, slow, painful, but necessary. He would find it, piece by piece, even if it took time. For now, he focused on what he could control. He began to make small, tentative steps towards co-parenting. He and Sophia had agreed to maintain a united front for their daughters, but David wasn't naive enough to think that it would be easy. He could already see the challenges ahead: awkward family gatherings, uncomfortable conversations, and the ever-present tension between him and Sophia. But he would take it one day at a time. The road ahead would be long, and there would be moments where he felt like giving up. But for the sake of his daughters, he had to try. As the days turned into weeks, David learned to find solace in the quiet moments, watching Emma and Lily laugh together, making small repairs around the house, and spending time alone, reflecting on the man he was becoming. He wasn't the same person he had been before Sophia's betrayal, but perhaps in time he would become someone stronger, someone who could face the future with hope, despite the pain of the past. Sophia, too, was grappling with her own version of the aftermath. The guilt and regret weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't undo what had been done. She had broken something irreparable, and all she could do now was try to make amends where she could, and live with the consequences. The road ahead for both of them was uncertain. There would be moments of tension, resentment, and pain, but there would also be opportunities for healing. For David, that healing began with accepting that life was no longer as it once was, and that in some ways, it never would be again. Rebuilding after betrayal. Time, David realized, was an unpredictable companion. It could heal wounds, or it could simply stretch out the ache, making it harder to ignore with each passing day. The truth was, after the confrontation with Sophia and the painful weeks that followed, he had no clear roadmap for how to rebuild his life. His emotions were raw, and the future felt like a vast, empty expanse that he had no idea how to navigate. But if there was one thing David had learned from his experience, it was that healing, though slow and difficult, was possible. And perhaps in the wreckage of his marriage, there was still a way to find peace. The first few months after the separation were excruciating. David spent his days trying to keep up with the routine of life, but everything had changed. The once familiar rhythms, his morning coffee with Sophia, the quiet dinners, the shared laughter after a long day, had been replaced with silence and uncertainty. There were no more comforting routines. Everything felt fragmented, as though the world he had known was irreparably broken. But amid the chaos, David kept coming back to one thing: his daughters. Emma and Lily were his anchor. They were still adjusting to the idea that their parents wouldn't be together anymore, and that hurt him more than he cared to admit. He wasn't sure how to make sense of it for them, especially when he couldn't make sense of it for himself. But every time they smiled at him, every hug and every laugh, it reminded him that there was something worth rebuilding. He owed them stability, love, and security, no matter how difficult the process of rebuilding his own life became. The co-parenting arrangement with Sophia, while challenging, became a focal point for David. They had both agreed that their daughters deserved the best they could give, despite the tension between them. At first, the exchanges were cold, formal, almost robotic. There was no room for kindness or warmth. But over time, as they worked through the mechanics of managing their daughters' schedules, they began to communicate in a way that was less about bitterness and more about necessity. There were moments when David would catch a glimpse of the person Sophia used to be, the woman he had fallen in love with. And for a split second, he wondered if it was possible to salvage what was lost. But the memory of the betrayal would always pull him back into reality. Rebuilding after betrayal. As time passed, David found himself slowly rebuilding his sense of self. He had spent so many years focusing on his family, on his role as a husband and father, that he had lost sight of who he was outside of those identities. He had forgotten about his own desires, his own passions, the things that made him feel alive before he was swept into the whirlwind of married life. He began to rediscover pieces of himself that had been buried under the weight of his marriage. He took up running, something he had always enjoyed but had abandoned years ago. The rhythmic sound of his feet hitting the pavement became a form of therapy, a way to release the anger and frustration that simmered beneath the surface. There were days when he wanted to give up, when the grief felt too heavy to carry. But with each run, he felt himself regaining control, reclaiming the parts of himself that had been lost in the wake of betrayal. It wasn't a cure, but it was a step toward healing. David also began to open up to friends, reconnecting with those he had distanced himself from during his marriage. He realized how much he had isolated himself over the years, consumed by the responsibilities of family and work. He hadn't allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways that could heal him. And now, with the distance between him and Sophia, he was learning the value of leaning on others. His friends were a lifeline, offering both a shoulder to lean on and a much-needed distraction from the pain. There were nights when he stayed up late talking to them, sharing his fears and doubts, allowing them to help him process the whirlwind of emotions that had taken over his life. In therapy, David began to confront the things he had buried for years: the shame, the regret, the self-doubt. The pain of betrayal had led him to question his own worth, his ability to be a good husband, a good father, a good person. But slowly, through the work he did with his therapist, he started to unravel the tangled mess of emotions that had built up inside him. He learned that healing wasn't just about moving on from the past. It was about understanding it, accepting it, and ultimately letting go. It was about forgiving himself for not seeing the warning signs, for not asking the tough questions when something didn't feel right. It was about accepting that, even in the face of betrayal, he was still worthy of love, respect, and happiness. Through therapy, David also began to understand the deeper complexities of his marriage with Sophia. The cracks in their relationship hadn't appeared overnight. They had formed slowly, over time, as unmet needs and unspoken feelings festered beneath the surface. While Sophia's affair was the catalyst for their breakup, David realized that the foundation of their relationship had already been compromised long before the affair had taken place. The lack of communication, the unaddressed emotional distance, and the failure to confront the challenges of life had all played a part in the unraveling of their marriage. This wasn't to excuse her actions, but it was to understand that the breakdown of their relationship wasn't entirely his fault. He had his own role to play in their demise, rebuilding and moving forward. As the months turned into a year, David started to feel a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. He wasn't naive enough to believe that he could fully erase the scars Sophia had left on his heart, but he was learning to live with them. He had come to realize that the process of rebuilding wasn't linear. There were still days when the weight of the past felt like it was suffocating him. There were still moments when the anger would resurface, threatening to undo all the progress he had made. But with each step forward, with each day that passed, he was building something new, something stronger. David wasn't the same person he had been before the betrayal, but maybe that was for the best. He had learned through the pain that he was resilient, that he could overcome even the deepest wounds. The life he was rebuilding wasn't the life he had planned, but it was his life, and it was enough. Sophia, for her part, was also rebuilding, though in a different way. She had to face the consequences of her actions, to confront the deep regret that weighed on her. She too was working toward healing, but David knew that it wasn't his responsibility to fix her. He couldn't do that for her. She had to rebuild her own life, just as he had to rebuild his. As for their daughters, Emma and Lily, they would never have the same family they once did. But with time, they would learn to navigate the changes, to adapt to their new reality. David knew that he would be there for them every step of the way, just as he would continue to work on himself. The journey of healing was far from over, but at least for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving towards something better.